I was planning just to talk about some tidbits Sandy Munro dropped concerning his chat with Elon Musk in Texas earlier this month. But then NASA dropped the Mars Perseverance lander video, which, by the way, is one of the coolest videos I've ever seen. So I figured, why not talk to you about both of these things today? Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. First, a really quick note. I'm super excited to be using my new Sony Alpha A7 III camera with a lovely Tamron 28-75 f2.8 lens. I'll be adjusting settings over the next few videos, but I hope you appreciate the improved video quality, better depth of field, and much better focus tracking. Hopefully we'll get rid of that back and forth hunting, which we all hate so much. At any rate, I hope you enjoy the improved quality. All right, let's start with Mars, which is, after all, what Starship is being built for. I'm going to be pulling some video from the NASA official release. I have to look over at my laptop to watch this, but of course I'll cut in the video in post-production so you can watch it as I'm talking about it. Also, very sadly, the microphone that they were going to use to record the descent audio apparently failed. They said they got no usable data out of it, so that's kind of a bummer, but such is life. And by the way, before we start watching the video, I sort of went down a rabbit hole because I was really curious what cameras they actually used to film the descent. The engineering cameras, like the serious ones that they did for science on the rover itself, are all sort of custom built and everything. But what they say, what NASA says, is they have off-the-shelf cameras that they used for the entry, descent, and landing. They had one on the back shell, one on the bottom of the rover, one on the descent engine itself, which is the thing that sky cranes it down, and I think there was one more. Anyway, there's several of them, but weirdly enough, they claim to be only 1.3 to 3.1 megapixels, which is very, very small. My kind of assumption was that it was a GoPro or something really, really similar to that, but those all have much higher megapixel ratings, so I'm not exactly sure. But I have a feeling that NASA is being very tight-lipped about this because, of course, they don't want, effectively, they don't want a company like Omega to be going like, we are the Mars landing cameras, right? They're not trying to give commercial support to anything, but I would be super interested to find out what the actual make of the cameras that they are using is. If anybody happens to know, I know that they were put on last minute. They weren't really kind of spec'd out for the trip until the very, very end when they just decided to throw it on. And I always love that stuff. It's when NASA puts things on at the last minute that they always have the coolest stuff that comes out of it, which this video is. But anyway, if you happen to know yourself, work for NASA or work for one of the contractors or something like that, and you happen to know what the make of the camera is, please do tell me in the comments. I'd be super interested. So the first thing we're going to look at is the parachute deployment, which, like I said, there's a camera on the back shell, which is, you can see where the parachute pops out from the back shell camera. The amazing thing to me about this was the absolute rapidity of the deployment. It doesn't even look like there's really much reefing or anything. And reefing, by the way, is what you usually see in the bigger parachutes where it comes out. And I guess there's a cable that's tied around the inside so it keeps the parachute from completely opening. It's kind of stuck. And then essentially, I guess what they do is they cut that like explosively or something. And as it unravels, it opens to its full size. This reduces the shock load on everything as the parachute opens. But it doesn't appear that that's happening here. Of course, this is a supersonic parachute, so it's more or less kind of like the drag parachute that is in the drogue chutes that are there before the main chutes come out with like Apollo or Crew Dragon or something along those lines. So it's a smaller parachute. It's not intended to slow the speed enough for the craft to settle gently on Mars. That's what the whole descent engine is for and everything, but it's supposed to slow it down a lot. So anyway, you can see the mortar shoots out and it just opens, bang. It just is like immediate. And even on the left, which is only 1/3 speed, you can see it still opens very, very rapidly. So it's pretty amazing. By the way, something that Scott Manley pointed out, and I would have had no idea, there's an Easter egg in the actual parachute code. So the orange, I guess, is ones and the white is zeros, and it kind of goes in rings, and it says "Dare Mighty Things," which is JPL's kind of logo or motto, excuse me. So it apparently says that. If you go around and you count like the numbers, it's the number, like the binary digits is the number in the alphabet for each one of those things. So anyway, there you go, because that's what happens when you have years to prepare for a mission. You end up putting Easter eggs in your parachute. Of course, the interesting thing is if they had not put that back shell camera on, no one would have even known that because, of course, no one's ever going to see the parachute again. It just took off after the descent stage dropped off. The parachute just floated to wherever it ended up crashing. But anyway, it's quite obvious from watching the full speed video that there is quite a bit of shock. And also you can see how large the cabling is. I know the camera is very close to it, but man, that's a substantial amount of cabling to deal with that incredible shock load when the parachute deploys. Of course, when the parachute deploys, that's after the entire first part of the descent. There really probably isn't much video of that because, of course, the heat shield is blocking the bottom part and it's screaming through the atmosphere. So this is about the last 3.5 minutes, which is more or less half of the landing sequence, right? The 7 minutes of terror. So the first half is just it going through the atmosphere with the heat shield displacing or burning away the speed and ablating as it encounters the friction with Mars's very thin atmosphere. So that's what goes on the first 3.5 minutes. The second 3.5 minutes are much more interesting, and so the parachute obviously is the first part of that sequence. The next part that we see is awesome. It's the bottom of the rover cam, and that is the heat shield disappearing. So explosively it gets, actually I don't know if it's, I think it is explosively, but there are springs as well. And as you watch the heat shield drop away, on the bottom right, so I guess like on a clock, it'd be like the 4 o'clock position. If you look at it, you can see a spring that's sort of come loose and is just bouncing around. So obviously what happens is there's some sort of, I think it is still pyrotechnic at its base, but once that happens, the pyrotechnics blow and then the springs, there's a bunch of springs around the heat shield base and they push the heat shield away so that it doesn't, come off and then immediately smack back into the rover, which would cause damage and all sorts of problems. But you can see it as soon as it's not attached to the parachute, of course, it's falling under Mars's gravity without any resistance. So it drops away much, much faster. Sadly enough, you actually don't get to see it collide with Mars. It kind of falls away and gets smaller and smaller, but then the parachute and, the rover kind of moves to a different place. So then time goes by as the heat shield drops away, and of course the parachute is controlling the descent and it becomes subsonic, etc. And about 1 minute and 15 seconds or so into the video, you can actually see 2 craters show up, which give us a sense. If we look at the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter picture of the Jezero crater, you can actually see it. It's kind of like upside down from the picture that I have. But anyway, you can see that there's 2 main craters. And obviously the terrain relative navigation has locked onto these kinds of features, which is super cool. This is a new thing with Perseverance that wasn't there for Curiosity or the other landers. So it's actually locking onto targets and determining where it wants to land. And I think from its chosen landing site, it only ended up being something like 9 or 10 meters off from that spot. So it was exceptionally accurate, which is incredible when you think about shooting, you're shooting a bullet from Earth. It's going out into the stars. It's going into orbit around Mars, not even into orbit. It's just slamming into Mars's atmosphere and then coming down just a few meters from where it was supposed to. It's almost miraculous that they have that much control over this stuff now. Good for JPL and good for NASA. Anyway, as the parachute keeps descending, you can see that the craters kind of go out of view of the ground camera. And you can also see that there's not a great deal of color contrast. It's very, very orange. It's a lot of rust there. There's a few sort of bluish, tealish kind of elements, but for the most part, it's pretty darn orange, and it's very, it looks kind of like an Arizona desert. And up to about 2 minutes and 5 seconds, you can see that it's kind of rocking back and forth under the parachute. But right about 2 minutes and 5 seconds, you can tell that the descent stage, which is its own little rocket ship, breaks off from the parachute stage. Immediately it smooths out because of course it's using its little engines, but also it does this crazy tip over move that looks super, super dangerous. But basically what it's doing is you've got the parachute stage, the back shell, this drops off and then it turns and it pushes away so that it doesn't interfere with the parachute at all. It just moves sideways some distance, I'm sure pre-calculated or whatever, but it goes away, and then after it goes away like this, it turns back and comes back a little ways and then settles in and starts descending directly towards Mars. Of course, as it's descending, it's so hard to tell scale here because there's no real atmospheric blurring because the atmosphere is so thin that it's not really blurring things out, and it's difficult to tell until we get to the part where the rocket engines actually start interacting with the ground, which actually came up sooner than I thought. I thought that it was actually still quite a ways up in the air, but it actually turned out to be much, much lower than I thought it was because the scale of the objects like the rocks and things like that were not obviously sized. But anyway, somewhere around 2 minutes and 45 seconds into the video, you actually see that the rocket engine exhaust starts to interact with the ground, and actually it blows quite a bit of dust around and everything. You can see it's a very, very fine dust over kind of a rocky, packed dirt slash rock, small boulders, not boulders, but like stones. It reminds me a great deal of Utah. I was in Utah last summer and last fall, and in southwestern Utah, there's this really thin dust layer over kind of more hard packed dust. It's still that same kind of reddish color, and then there's little rocks all over the place. So it really reminded me a lot of the Utah desert. Right around 2 minutes and 50 seconds, the actual sky crane starts to work. So the rover itself gets lowered from the descent stage. So you've got the descent stage that's sitting on top, holding the rover in it, and then it starts to lower the rover down. The deal is that you don't want to get the rocket engines too close to the ground, because obviously you can see they're interacting with the ground a lot. They're kicking up a lot of dust. You don't want to create little craters or any kind of bad things. So it lowers it about 6 meters down. The actual rover itself 6 meters down from the descent stage mothership. And the 3-part video of this, by the way, is just absolutely stunning. I keep watching it over and over again and watching the different elements, but I love the fact that the rover has an up-looking camera so that you can actually see the descent stage. And by the way, look how non-existent the plumes of exhaust are, the propellant exhaust. It's a monopropellant which is run over a catalyst, which causes it to expand rapidly. But as opposed to a lot of the animations that are there, there's not really enough oxygen or atmosphere on Mars that the propellant can react with to cause it to actually glow. So it's basically just a clear, it's just pumping out clear particles, right? Which, on the other hand, on the right-hand image, you can see interacting with the Martian dirt and dust and everything and blowing it around. But you don't see like big animated jet flames coming out of it or anything like that. Also notice that the descent engines are actually canted out away, because obviously you don't want to be blowing your exhaust straight down onto the rover itself. So this is all very, very cleverly created. It was done originally with Curiosity back in 2012, and everyone thought it was nuts, but it actually seems to be a really good system, and they've landed 2 rovers exceptionally well on Mars. And somewhere around 3 minutes and 5 seconds or so, unfortunately, right when the dust gets super kicked up, because of course the camera on the bottom of the rover is very, very close to the ground, right around there is when touchdown or Tango Delta happens. And at 3 minutes and 9 seconds into the video, you see the ascent stage. What happens is it cuts the cables. There's a guillotine, 3 of them. I think I can't remember. There's a bunch of cables. You can count them. One of them is actually an Ethernet cable. The one that's kind of a curlicue that's not really supporting any weight is honestly just an Ethernet data cable that's between the 2 of them, which is kind of wild. But the other ones are support cables, and guillotines chop all of those. And then at 309, you can see the descent stage take off and just fly away. It doesn't really matter where that goes as long as it's far, far away from the rover, because obviously you don't want it crashing back on the rover. So it just kind of tips over, takes off, and crashes somewhere else. And by the way, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter has located all of these elements, and it's pretty darn cool when you can see them all like on the surface. And then of course, finally, you get to cut back to JPL and watch all the people go absolutely nuts that their aircraft has actually landed. It's so cool. It brings tears to my eyes every time when you watch that happen and you see how happy everybody is.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars, ready to begin seeking the signs of past life.
And finally, of course, this is not part of the original video, which, by the way, is in the description. You can watch the entire thing. It's only 3.5 minutes, so why not? You should watch it over and over and over again like I did. But after the rover landed on the ground, it took a couple of quick black and white pictures that were just to show that it was there and give some sense of the terrain. And then it has been since just dumping data over and over and over again. Lots and lots of data, lots of amazing pictures so far. The coolest one, I think, is the VR one, which is like a whole sort of 180-degree surround thing. The thing that just blows my mind is the intensity of the stars, the Milky Way above. I just think it's just fascinating. Again, I'll put a link to that actual thing in the description, but I'll try to take a couple of screen grabs and put them up here just so you can look. But obviously, you can manipulate this because it's VR, so you can actually move it around on your computer. Or if you have VR helmet goggles, you can actually pretend like you're there for real. How cool is that? So yeah, that's the Mars landing. Absolutely stunning footage. It's the beginning of, hopefully a decade of incredible discoveries. And maybe with luck, we'll discover organic chemicals and discover that there was life there at one point. Or even better, perhaps there is still life kind of hanging out under the surface, protected from the UV rays and hanging on barely to life on a very, very inhospitable planet. All right, and now we'll turn to Sandy Munro talking about Starship. But first, if you do enjoy this video, please do like it so other people can find it. And of course, subscribe for more of these kinds of things. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon. You all are so wonderful. Thank you all so much for your support. And as always, don't forget about our merch store. Here's one of the latest. We've got the plaid model, plaid Tesla logo. We also have, of course, the all input is error t-shirt and mugs and tumblers, things like that that's on the back. So please do check out the merch store. The link is in the description. And of course, you will help the channel out if you purchase anything from it. So thank you for that too. As always, a big thank you to Zenly Music for the intro and conclusion music. And of course, don't forget that we are both Tesla and Amazon affiliates. The links are in the description. If you click the links, you help support the channel. So again, thank you all so much. Just very briefly before we talk about Starship, I wanted to address Elon's tweet about the standard range Model Y, where he said it was still available off menu, etc. And some people have complained, I did a video, I'll link it up here, that talks about my rationale for why the standard range was discontinued. It's not discontinued officially, but of course you have to go through many, many extra steps to order one of those. But I still think, regardless of what his excuse was, which seems a little bit lame, and too much complexity in their catalog and supply chain, etc., I don't really buy that. I still think it was so successful that they've removed it from site so people don't order it as much. So they can still claim it's there, but it's really hard to find, and so people won't generally find it, so they'll order the more expensive, more profitable ones instead. Alrighty, so on to Sandy Munro and Corey Steuben talking about their trip out west. This is specifically, I'll link the video description in here, plus actually the original that it came from, which is like 40 minutes, I think, or something. Fascinating stuff. But this is specifically about their interview with Elon in Texas and about Starship and the facilities and the amazing stuff that they discovered. So, of course, the first thing that they discover, and big surprise this, is that Elon is running behind. I can't imagine that he's ever on time to anything. He just sounds like he is such a busy guy.
She said, "Oh, running behind 2 hours. Do you mind if we give you a tour for 2 hours?" And Sandy and I are like, sign me up.
But the incredible part here is that they were offered about a 2-hour tour of the facilities. And what a dream that is. By the way, if you want to help support me this summer in June, I think, I'm going to be making a pilgrimage to the Starship, Boca Chica, the launch facilities, and also to the Giga Texas factory in Austin. I'm going to be driving the Model Y over there. Hopefully my son will go with me and we'll video it and blog it and everything. But anyway, if you want to support our trip, you certainly can do that by sending us a little something on Patreon or just shopping or something. But anyway, while I'm there, if I could somehow convince somebody to give me a tour of SpaceX's facilities, that would be like a dream come true. So anyway, Sandy's comments about that tour are really, really revealing. He is absolutely blown away by the speed that SpaceX is working. They are just cranking through things. He talks about, and I didn't even know this, he apparently worked for NASA and other rocket contractors in his past. What hasn't Sandy Munro done? I mean, seriously, this guy's like been everywhere, it seems.
And watching what they were doing versus what everybody else in the world has done, like a launch vehicle was 2 years in the making for NASA. They're shooting for one every 3 days. Yeah. That kind of puts things into perspective. When you're talking to someone like Elon Musk, you get a much different impression of how fast is fast versus someone who's a fixed in place scientist.
But anyway, he talks about how other rocket companies will build like a rocket a year or something. And SpaceX is talking about building multiple rockets, multiple Starships and Super Heavies per week rather than per year. So he's just talking about like the incredible like orders of magnitude gap between traditional rocket building and the way Starship does it. I also think it's utterly fascinating to hear him talk about the way that Starship develops. I think of the way Starship develops is a cross between me when I was 12 years old and the Soviets in the 1960s. It's kind of an empirical thing, right? You build something, you try it out, it explodes. You're like, how come that didn't work? You try again. Very, very antithetical to the sort of German-born NASA, United States rocketry methodology, which is very, very careful, very, very slow. Build a piece, build a piece, build a piece, test it, test it, test it. Hopefully no failures, right? So it's a different methodology. And when I talk about me being 12, me and my friend, especially Carl, shout out to Carl, we used to just go blow things up. We would take planes, we would take bottles of propane. I don't even want to talk about it. It was very bad, very illegal, I'm sure. But we didn't kill ourselves, so that was good. But you learn a lot of things by breaking stuff. And so SpaceX is fully committed to that. And Sandy talks about the fact that like the SN8, SN9, hopefully not SN10, hopefully SN10 will launch very well in a couple of days. But anyway, if and when those crash, it's just more data points. They're okay with that. You know, it's not like, I think there's a lot of news articles talking about how SpaceX is failing with all of this stuff. That's not the case at all. SpaceX is doing exactly what they want to do. They've got a whole line of these things built and they're just cranking them out. They're throwing them up in the air. They're trying to figure out how to land them. Once they get that done, they're going to have to slap some heat tiles on it and try to get it really high in the air and bring it back down at, probably suborbital velocities first, but then orbital velocities, which will cause heating on the windward side, etc. So they've got all of this stuff going on, but they're just cranking through this as fast as they can, which is pretty cool.
I was impressed with their willingness to do iterative learning through trial and error.
Right.
And the person who gave us a tour showed us the header tank and explained the problem that they had on the header tank on SN8 and why that failed and the things that they did to change it. And here we are standing and nothing's roped off. There's no clean room. It looked more like an oil rig, you know, with people welding everywhere. And we went inside SN15.
It's also really interesting to listen to what Corey has to say about the look of the facilities, where he says it's more like an oil rig than a science experiment, which is really kind of interesting. So it's very much a get her done kind of attitude. And it's, I think that's an interesting little connection because, of course, they have purchased oil rigs for the purpose of landing and taking off on the ocean. Well, at least taking off. I don't know about landing, but definitely taking off from oil rigs on the ocean as opposed to on shore. So that's all fascinating stuff. But, he's basically saying this is a factory. This is a place where people are getting work done, not a science experiment, a lab that's all clean and people are very carefully working. Corey and Sandy also talk about specifically the landing legs and structural elements of the vehicles. Unfortunately, they don't get into details about it, but it's quite clear that the design team at SpaceX is working really, really hard to figure out how to deal with landing and the stresses of that and how to keep the Starship as rigid as possible without adding a lot of extra weight, obviously. I also love how Corey talks about removing the stigma of failure. I think that's really important.
When it comes down and blows up, it's no big wow. It's just another experiment. These are experiments. They're tests. So they tested a lot of stuff. They're happy with some things, but when it comes back down, if it blows up, so what? They're going to scrap it anyway. It doesn't really matter to them.
So they kind of remove that stigma of space development, space flight development without failure. So they have to accept that during the development process.
It's interesting as a researcher myself, there is I know for a fact that you learn more from failure than you do from success. Failure is how you go well, that didn't work. So what am I thinking about this wrong? What's wrong with my thought process about this? So how can I go back and fix that? If you succeed at something, all that does is reconfirm what you already knew, right? So there's more to be learned from failure than from success. And I think Corey, he nailed that. He was right all over that. Then there's a little amusing story about how they're using an iPhone, I think it was either an 11 or 12, with a very simple setup for their filming. And Elon kind of is mind blown about that. It kind of cracks me up because it makes me realize just how important a person Elon Musk is, because he's like, nobody films me with this stuff, right? They all get their multi-$1,000 rigs out and really, really make sure that they're filming me with the highest quality possible. Whereas Sandy and Corey are kind of busting in there with their, their run and gun rig, which by the way is great. I think my iPhone 12 shoots amazing video, but it's very kind of low rent compared to, I'm sure, what Elon Musk saw.
It's just a phone. Oh, it is. The phone is the camera?
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, we don't waste too much money on fancy stuff.
It works, I guess.
Then, of course, they brush over the interview that Sandy did with Elon Musk, and I'll put the link in that in the description as well. There's a nice long interview the two of them had. It's amazing. But then they get to the last part that I think is just absolutely fascinating. And part of this, the tour, and also this part, which is that they were invited to a design review meeting that lasted for hours, and they finally actually left at like 10:30 at night. They said they just hadn't eaten all day and they were just exhausted.
But the thing that I thought was even more amazing was after I got done, I shook his hand and he said, "We're going to have a design review. You want to stick around?" We spent 2 hours watching a design review. I was blown away. I've seen dozens of CEOs. I've never seen a CEO ever, or a president, that knew more about the product, that knew the details of a product, that could bring an idea and discuss it, not just in, grandiose hand waving kind of, but hey, let's use this formula and rattle off a formula, or rattle off a material, or rattle off a process that is kind of obscure unless you're like a detail engineer. I was blown away.
But, Elon Musk and his team were still there working well into the night. And I'm frankly not surprised. I have like a Twitter, I follow him on Twitter, and 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning pops up tweets all of a sudden. So you can see when Elon's not working, and it's usually kind of fringe. It's usually early in the morning and late at night. And he obviously, I think he talked on Joe Rogan how he gets 6 hours of sleep a night. Unfortunately, I need 8. What can I say? I can't sleep that little. But clearly, I think a lot of very successful people have very, very light sleep habits. But anyway, he's clearly working all the time, all hours of the day and night. But also, how incredible is this that SpaceX gave them a complete tour? They went inside the serial number 15 and looked at the super heavy booster and everything. And then they were invited to a design review meeting. And Sandy actually said that he gave them a suggestion about something. And Elon said, "Wow, we hadn't thought about that before. We should try that." So it just shows the openness and the way that SpaceX is developing this in kind of a transparent manner. And I think that's incredible. It's so different than, Boeing as an example. But a lot of times, a lot of these companies, I think, have been in bed with defense contractors since the 50s and 60s. And there's just this sort of ingrained, like, don't tell anybody anything. It's all classified, even if it's not classified. And SpaceX is totally different. They're like, come on down, check out our Texas ranch, have a look around, you bang the wall of the Starship and see what's going on. Have a talk with the CEO, the CTO, Chief Rocket Engineer. Anyway, have a talk with him. Go on a tour, stick around for a design meeting and see what we're all talking about. If we're talking about landing legs, see what kind of structural issues we're having to deal with. But anyway, all of those things is just so open and so refreshing. And it really does feel a little bit like a kid working on this stuff. They're so excited. They're like, hey, you want to share all of these cool things that we're doing. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to bring that up. I guess this is my little child being excited about the world again, like an optimism kind of thing. It's like Perseverance landed and it was magical. And then Sandy Munro and Corey got to go and talk to Elon Musk. But not only that, they got to tour the facilities. They got to be in on a design meeting. They got to partake of all of this stuff. And as a child, my child heart inside me just goes like, yay, this is exactly the kind of thing that I would do if I could. I'm so fascinated by this. I just admire NASA and JPL for doing what they did with the Perseverance. And all of this stuff takes so much work and so many years of work. And you can see that happening with SpaceX as well, but they're kind of doing it in the public eye. Right? We've got Lab Padre, Boca Chica Gal, Everyday Astronaut, all sorts of people who are hanging around watching them do this, warts and all. And it's just fascinating that SpaceX is as open to that as they are. So amazing stuff, guys. All right, I hope you found this episode fun and enjoyable. If you did, definitely make sure you like and subscribe so other people can find it as well. And in the meantime, please do ask me questions in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time, bye-bye.